In a quiet town near the border of Oklahoma, there was a place where time seemed to stand still. The streets were lined with old, worn-down buildings that whispered stories of better days. I lived there once, in a crumbling apartment tucked into one of the more run-down neighborhoods. It wasn't much, but it was all we could afford at the time. The walls carried the weight of years, and the air always felt heavy, like the past had never left. This town had a reputation, and not a good one. It was a place where crime wasn't news, it was routine. People talked about break-ins like they were weather reports. Sirens screamed into the night, and figures moved in the shadows. But somehow, none of it really scared me. I had seen worse before. Oak Cliff, a tough part of Dallas, had hardened me to a lot of things. Compared to that, this small town felt almost manageable, or so I thought. The apartment itself wasn't inviting. The floors creaked with every step, and the windows seemed to rattle even when the wind was still. But life didn't leave much room for comfort. We just dealt with it. Nights were quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful but tense, like the calm before a storm. I convinced myself it was just the way things were, that nothing would happen if I didn't let my imagination run wild. But looking back, I realized I had ignored the subtle warnings that something wasn't right. And then, on one otherwise ordinary evening, it started, the kind of event that pulls the ground out from under you and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about safety. That night, everything felt normal. I was off work and decided to spend the evening relaxing with a book. I was lying on the floor in the living room, completely lost in the story. Hours passed without me even realizing it. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Eventually, I got up to use the bathroom. As I stepped toward the hallway, something stopped me dead in my tracks. Muddy footprints. They stretched across the floor, leading directly toward the spot where I had been lying. My chest tightened as I stared at the trail, and every sense in my body screamed that something was wrong. The footprints weren't mine. They didn't belong to anyone who should have been there. They came from the back of the apartment, where the windows were. I stood frozen for a moment, the realization sinking in. Someone had been inside. My eyes followed the muddy trail as it led me down the hallway, each step growing heavier with dread. It guided me to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open cautiously, my heart pounding. Inside, the footprints were clearer now. They started at the window near the top of the bed and crossed over the bedspread, leaving faint smudges of mud. Then they circled back to the window. The window latch was loose, and the glass was slightly open, just enough for someone to slip through. I stood there, piecing it together. Whoever it was had come in through the window, walked across the bed, and moved through the apartment while I was just feet away, completely unaware. I couldn't tell if they were gone or still hiding somewhere. Every sound seemed amplified, and every shadow felt alive. My hands were trembling as I searched the apartment. I checked every corner, every closet, under the bed, anywhere someone could hide. But no one was there. It felt impossible. The front door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone leaving. Yet, the footprints told a different story. Someone had been inside, but they had vanished without a trace. What sent a chill through me wasn't just the thought of an intruder, it was the detail that didn't make sense. The blanket I had used to cover the bedroom window was still pinned perfectly in place. There wasn't a single crease, as if it hadn't been touched. But it had to have been moved for someone to come through that window. The thought of how careful and deliberate they must have been made my skin crawl. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Sleep became impossible. My mind replayed the scene over and over, imagining what could have happened if I had turned around or if the intruder had stayed longer. Even though I didn't see them, the idea that they might have stood there, watching me as I read, haunted me. The thought of being so close to someone who shouldn't have been there made me feel exposed, vulnerable. It was like my home wasn't mine anymore. It became a place of fear, not safety. Weeks passed, but the fear didn't go away. Every night felt like a battle to keep my nerves in check. My girlfriend tried to be supportive at first, but she hadn't been there that night. She couldn't fully understand why I was so scared. To her, it was just an isolated incident, something to move past. But for me, it wasn't that simple. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone had gotten in so easily and then disappeared without a sound. The uncertainty was the worst part, wondering if they would come back, if they were still watching. Eventually, my anxiety started to wear on her. She suggested we move, but leaving wasn't something we could afford. So, I stayed, trapped in a place that no longer felt like home. Even after years had passed, the memory of that night stayed with me. Sometimes, when I was alone, I'd catch myself glancing at the windows, expecting to see muddy footprints or hear the creak of someone moving through the apartment. The fear had faded, but the questions never did. I kept wondering why they didn't come closer, or why they didn't take anything. What were they looking for? Or worse, what were they planning to do? The fact that I'll never know is what unsettles me the most. It's a mystery that still lingers in the back of my mind, reminding me how quickly safety can be taken away. Even now, I sometimes find myself revisiting that night in my mind, piecing together the events over and over. I wonder if I missed something, some small clue that could explain how they got in or why they chose to leave without a trace. Was it someone familiar with the neighborhood? A stranger just passing through? Or was it something else entirely? The questions are endless, and the answers never come. It's the not knowing that keeps the fear alive, even years later. That sense of vulnerability, of realizing how easily someone had invaded my space, has stayed with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't what happened, it's what might have happened. It was a quiet night like any other, but something about the stillness felt heavy. My room was my safe space, tucked at the back of the house where the world outside rarely reached me. The window, closed and covered by thick curtains, faced the backyard, a place no one ever had a reason to be. Our neighborhood was busy during the day, but at night it fell into a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional sound of distant traffic. I lived there with my parents and two brothers. Life was normal, predictable even, and I had never felt uneasy in my own home. But that sense of safety was about to be tested in a way I could never have imagined. It started with a sound that was impossible to ignore. It happened late one night, just as I was getting ready for bed. The house was quiet, and my curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the darkness outside. Then, out of nowhere, I heard 3 loud knocks on my window. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like someone wanted to make sure I noticed it. I froze, my heart racing. My window faced the backyard, so whoever was knocking had to be standing there, in a place no one should be. I couldn't bring myself to pull back the curtain. Instead, I ran straight to my dad, barely able to explain what I'd heard. He checked the backyard, but it was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, and he told me not to worry. But that sound, it stayed with me, long after everything else had gone quiet again. The next night, it happened again, 3 knocks, just as loud and deliberate as before. This time, the sound came at almost the exact same time as the night before. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait or hesitate. I ran straight to my dad again, panicked and desperate for answers. He opened the curtains, stepped outside, and searched the backyard with a flashlight. Like before, there was no one there. The yard was empty, and everything was still. But this time, the feeling was different. I couldn't shake the sense that whoever or whatever was doing this wasn't going to stop. A few nights later, I was home alone when it happened again. The knocks came, loud and clear, breaking the silence like a sharp warning. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and called my parents. They were out of town and told me to ask the neighbors for help. I contacted them, and they checked the backyard. But once again, no one was there. The knocks weren't happening every night, but they were frequent enough to keep me on edge. The worst part was the unpredictability. Sometimes it was early evening, other times late at night. I never knew when to expect it, and the unease was starting to feel unbearable. One night, the knocking was different. It wasn't the usual 3 quick taps. This time, it was steady and deliberate, more insistent than before. It pulled me out of a deep sleep, and for a moment, I thought about pulling back the curtain to see who or what was out there. But fear stopped me. My hands froze, and all I could do was listen. The knocking didn't stop right away, but eventually, the sound faded, leaving an eerie silence in its place. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, unable to calm the growing sense of dread. The thought of someone standing just outside my window, so persistent and bold, made it impossible to feel safe in my own home. The night I finally looked out the window changed everything. The knocks came again, the same sharp, deliberate pattern that had haunted me for days. This time, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, my hands trembling. Outside, crouched near the window, was a figure. They were wearing a grey hoodie and dark jeans, but the darkness made it hard to see any details. My breath caught, and I froze, staring at them for what felt like forever. Then, as if sensing they'd been seen, they slipped away into the shadows before I could do anything. The sight of them confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't random, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there, and they knew exactly what they were doing. After seeing the figure, my parents decided it was time to call the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the backyard and the area around our house. They didn't find anyone or anything out of the ordinary. Without solid evidence or more details, there wasn't much they could do besides give us advice. They suggested installing cameras around the house, especially near my bedroom window. The next day, we followed their advice. Cameras were set up to cover every angle, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of relief. But deep down, I knew the cameras might not stop whoever or whatever was out there. For a few nights, everything seemed normal. The knocking stopped, and the house felt calm again. I started to believe that maybe it was over, that whoever had been tormenting us had finally moved on. I even managed to sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, but the quiet didn't last. One night, just as I was starting to feel safe again, the sound returned. 3 sharp knocks, just as deliberate as before, echoing in the stillness. My heart sank as I realized that whatever was happening wasn't finished. Even with the cameras, even with everything we had done, the fear was back and it felt stronger than ever. The house was nothing out of the ordinary. It was a split-level home with a basement that was partly underground. During the day, sunlight would stream through the windows, giving the space a warm, almost comforting feeling. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect anything strange to happen. I spent a lot of time there, sorting through old boxes, doing small chores, or just finding quiet moments away from the rest of the house. At first glance, Everything about the basement felt normal, just another part of the home. But it had a stillness to it, a kind of quiet that felt too heavy sometimes. It was the kind of quiet you'd only notice when you were completely alone. At least, that's what I thought. Looking back, maybe I wasn't as alone as I believed. One afternoon, I went down to the basement to find a box of fishing hooks. The sunlight was coming in through the windows, so I didn't bother turning on the lights. As I sorted through the clutter, I accidentally knocked the box of hooks off the table, and they spilled everywhere. I bent down to pick them up, focused on the mess, when the basement light suddenly turned on. For a moment, I thought my husband had come home early and switched it on to help me. But when I called out to thank him, there was no response. I looked around, and the house was completely silent. That's when I remembered I was alone, and the only other living thing in the house was my dog upstairs. The light switch had physically flipped up, but no one was there to do it. After that day, strange things started happening more often. One afternoon, I had just finished vacuuming the stairs. I left the vacuum plugged in the living room while I went to switch the laundry. Suddenly, I heard the vacuum turn on by itself. I froze, my heart racing. From the hallway, I could see the vacuum running, even though no one was there to press the button. My dog stood next to me, staring at it too, as if he also knew something was off. It wasn't the first time something like this happened, but it was becoming harder to explain away. Small things, harmless at first, but unsettling every single time. One evening, I went back to the basement to grab the dog's food. As I bent down near the storage closet, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It looked like my husband, walking quietly toward the shelves where we kept canned goods. I didn't think much of it at first and even called out to ask if he needed anything. But there was no reply. When I turned to look, the figure was gone. Confused, I went back upstairs, only to find my husband on the opposite side of the house. He hadn't been in the basement at all. That's when it hit me I'd seen someone, or something, that shouldn't have been there. Not long after, my husband had his own strange experience. He'd always been skeptical of the odd things I mentioned, brushing them off as coincidences. But this time, it was different. He was home alone when he called me, sounding shaken. Mid-conversation, he suddenly stopped and whispered, "Someone's here." I didn't hear the dog bark, which made it even stranger. After a moment, he told me he saw someone in a flannel shirt walking outside near the door. He hung up quickly to check, but when he searched the yard, there was no one there. For the first time, he couldn't explain what he'd seen. It left him uneasy, and I could tell he was starting to believe that something was really wrong. As we tried to make sense of what was happening, I started to think about the history of the house. It was built in the 1970s, not particularly old, and nothing tragic had ever happened here as far as we knew. We had bought the house from my husband's family, and they had lived in it for years without any strange stories. But there was something about the property itself that felt different. Before this house, there had been an older one on the same land. It was torn down long before we moved in, and no one really talked about it. I couldn't help but wonder if something from that past had stayed behind, something tied to the land, not the walls around us. It was a thought that gave me no answers, only more questions. Even after everything we experienced, we were left with more questions than answers. The lights, the vacuum, the figure in the basement, all of it pointed to something we couldn't explain. My husband, once the skeptic, now avoided the basement entirely, and I couldn't blame him. We never saw the figure again, but the unease never fully left us. Every creak, every flicker of a shadow felt like a reminder. What made it harder was the lack of closure. There was no final event, no grand explanation, just a lingering sense that something was still there, watching, waiting, or simply existing alongside us. We moved on with our lives, but the mystery stayed, etched into the walls of our minds, refusing to fade. The uneasiness in the house never truly went away. We tried to act like everything was normal, but deep down, we both knew it wasn't. Even on quiet nights, I found myself listening for sounds I couldn't explain, glancing over my shoulder when I went into the basement. My husband, though he didn't talk about it much, seemed to carry the same tension. We couldn't ignore what had happened, but there was no way to confront it either. The house stayed the same. The world outside carried on, but something invisible lingered. We learned to live with the questions, even if the answers never came. And while life moved forward, a part of us stayed stuck, forever wondering what or who might still be there, just out of sight. The house was old and far from town, surrounded by open land and quiet roads. It wasn't the kind of place where people just dropped by. We rented it from a landlord who lived a couple of miles away. My dad and brothers worked hard to keep things running, and I spent most of my time at home. It was peaceful in a way, but the isolation could be unsettling, especially at night. The house felt like it had been there forever. The paint was peeling, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. Outside, the yard was fenced, and our dog kept watch. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. At least, that's what we tried to believe. Looking back, I realized the house wasn't the only thing that made me uneasy. It was who came with it. The landlord was an older man, polite but quiet. He didn't visit often, but when he did, it was always unexpected. He'd usually stop by to talk to my dad or check on the house, staying just long enough to make his presence known. At first, I didn't think much of it. He seemed harmless, just a bit odd. But things started to feel different when he began showing up when my dad and brothers weren't home. He never stayed long, only walking around the property or asking vague questions about how we were doing. Something about the way he looked at the house, or maybe the way he lingered, made me uncomfortable. It was subtle, but enough to put me on edge. One afternoon, I was home alone when I saw his car slowly coming up the driveway. My heart sank. It wasn't the first time he had arrived unannounced, but this time, it felt different. There was no reason for him to be there, and without my dad or brothers around, I felt exposed. He parked and got out, casually walking up to the house. I stayed inside, watching from the window. He knocked on the door a few times but didn't wait long before turning around and leaving. It was quick and uneventful, but something about the visit stuck with me. It didn't feel like a simple check-in, it felt like he was testing something. A few weeks later, it happened again. I was alone, and this time, he didn't just knock and leave. After parking his car, he started walking around the house. I heard his footsteps on the gravel, then on the porch. He tried each door, one by one, rattling the handles as if testing them. My heart raced as I quickly locked every door and window I could reach. It didn't stop there. He began looking into the windows, pausing to peer inside as if searching for something or someone. My dog barked furiously from the yard, but the landlord didn't seem bothered. I stayed hidden, praying he would leave, but his presence lingered longer than before. This wasn't a normal visit anymore. It felt deliberate, and it was terrifying. Then, he started calling my name. His voice was loud and clear, cutting through the walls of the house. "Eleanor," he said, his tone unsettlingly cheerful, almost playful. "I know you're in there. Why don't you come outside?" My heart pounded as I crouched in the corner of the kitchen, gripping my phone. He kept talking, his words growing stranger. "I brought something special for you." Don't keep me waiting." The way he spoke made my skin crawl, like he was taunting me. I texted my dad in a panic, telling him everything. The landlord's footsteps moved around the house, stopping at each window, but he didn't leave. Every second felt like an eternity. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, as the minutes dragged on. The landlord didn't leave right away. He walked around the house, pacing slowly, calling my name every now and then. My dog barked relentlessly outside, but nothing seemed to scare him off. He stayed for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 30 minutes. Finally, without warning, he stopped. I heard his footsteps fade as he walked back to his car and drove away, as casually as he had arrived. My body was frozen with fear, even after he was gone. I didn't move from my hiding spot until my dad got home. When I told him everything, his face darkened with anger, but there was little we could do. The landlord hadn't done anything illegal, just enough to terrify me. After that day, things changed. My dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was angry and worried. He started coming home earlier, and my brothers kept a closer eye on things around the house. None of us trusted the landlord anymore, but confronting him felt risky. We didn't know what he might do if he was pushed. A few weeks later, my dad made the decision. We were moving. He didn't explain it in detail, but I knew it was because of what had happened. Packing up felt like a relief, but the fear lingered. I couldn't stop wondering how the landlord had known I was alone that day, or what he might have done if he'd gotten inside. The question stayed with me, unanswered and unsettling. We left the house soon after, but the memory of that day stayed with me. Even in our new home, I found myself double-checking locks and peeking through curtains whenever I heard a car outside. The sense of safety I once had was gone, replaced by a constant awareness of how quickly things can go wrong. I often think about the landlord, his calm demeanor, the way he walked around the house like he owned more than just the property. What did he want that day? Why had he called my name? I'll never know, but one thing is certain. Leaving that house was the best decision we ever made. Some questions are better left unanswered. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. My friends and I had decided to hang out at the park near the edge of town. The park wasn't very big, but it had a few trails that led into the woods. We liked going there. It felt like our own little escape from the world. The paths were surrounded by tall trees, and the further you went, the more the sounds of the town faded away. We were laughing and joking as we walked, not paying much attention to anything around us. The woods had always felt safe to us, like a secret place where no one else ever went. But that day, something was different. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. As we walked deeper into the woods, a sound broke the silence, a rustling noise from behind us. At first, we thought it might be an animal, so we stopped and looked back. That's when we saw him. An older man, maybe in his 60s, stood at the edge of the trail. He was wearing dirty clothes, and his dog sat quietly by his side. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at us. His expression was blank, but there was something about the way he watched us that made my stomach drop. None of us said anything. We just stood there, frozen, trying to figure out if he was lost or if we were the ones in the wrong place. We decided to keep walking, hoping he would stay where he was or maybe turn back. But when we glanced over our shoulders, he was still there, moving slowly toward us. His steps were steady, and he didn't say a word. That's when the uneasiness turned into fear. We whispered to each other, trying to figure out what to do. None of us wanted to act scared, but the way he kept coming closer felt wrong. Finally, One of my friends muttered, "Run." Without thinking, we took off down the trail, our footsteps pounding against the dirt as the trees blurred past us. We ran as fast as we could until we reached a fork in the trail. Without stopping to think, we split up, agreeing to meet further down where the paths reconnected. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I didn't dare slow down. Every sound in the woods seemed amplified: the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally regrouped, we were out of breath and shaking. We tried to convince ourselves that we'd just overreacted, that the man and his dog had probably turned back. But before we could calm down, we saw him again. He was at the bridge up ahead, standing there like he'd been waiting for us. My chest tightened as his gaze locked on us, and we knew we had to keep running. The moment we saw him move toward us, panic set in. We didn't think, we just ran. This time, we didn't stick to the trails. We darted into the trees, taking random turns and pushing through branches, desperate to lose him. The woods felt endless, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. We didn't stop to look back. All we could hear was the pounding of our own footsteps and the thudding of our hearts. The fear was overwhelming, the kind that doesn't let you think straight. We didn't know where we were going, we just needed to get away from him. Eventually, we burst out of the trees and onto the edge of the park's playground. Families were scattered around, kids laughing and playing, completely unaware of what we had just been through. We stopped running and tried to catch our breath, staying close to the crowd. For the first time since we'd seen the man, we felt a little safer. We looked back toward the woods, half expecting him to appear again, but there was nothing. Just the quiet rustling of the trees in the distance. The sight of other people gave us a sense of relief, but the fear hadn't fully left. We stuck together, silently agreeing not to go back into the woods anytime soon. For weeks after that day, none of us went near the woods. Even just walking past the park made my stomach twist. We talked about what had happened, replaying every detail, trying to make sense of it. Why had he followed us? What did he want? None of us could answer those questions, but the way he stared at us and moved so deliberately still haunted me. It wasn't just fear, it was the mystery of it all. The man hadn't spoken, hadn't made any move to explain himself. He just followed, silent and steady, like he knew exactly what he was doing. We couldn't stop thinking about it, and even though we tried to move on, the memory of that day stayed with us. It was the kind of fear that leaves a mark, no matter how much time passes. Years later, we still talk about that day. Sometimes it comes up when we're sharing old memories or trying to scare each other with stories, but this one feels different. It wasn't just a weird encounter, it was something that stuck with us, something that felt unfinished. None of us ever saw the man again, but the thought of him lingers. We still wonder why he was there and why he was so determined to follow us. Was it just curiosity? Something darker? We'll never know, and maybe that's what makes it so unsettling. It's not just the memory of being chased, it's the unanswered questions that keep the fear alive, even all these years later.